Euthanasia and end-of-life care. The first thing I want to look at is the distinction between euthanasia, palliative care, or hospice, because these are essentially the three options that people talk about in terms of end-of-life care. Euthanasia, of course, the most controversial of these, and the one we're going to focus on, means help with a good death. It's intended to end the suffering of terminally ill patients and to allow the patient to die with dignity on their own terms. And so the concept of euthanasia is one in which an individual is in a hopeless situation. This person has been declared a terminal case. They are dying of their condition. It is going to deteriorate. It's going to become more painful. They're going to lose control of their facilities and so on. And so people have argued that they should have the right to end their life when they choose and how they choose, rather than to have to go through that decline. There are, of course, a number of moral concerns that are associated with that. We also have the option of what's called palliative care. Palliative care is specialized medical care for people living with a serious illness. Palliative care is meant to enhance a person's current care by focusing on quality of life for them and their family. Now, while a person is engaged in palliative care, they may still be being treated for their condition. They could still be taking medication or other treatments for it, but the emphasis is not upon trying to make that person better, because it's essentially a terminal case. They're not going to get better, but it's in making sure that they can enjoy what time is left of their life to the best of their ability. And so the drugs that are used tends to be more in line with easing the pain and easing the suffering of the condition, whereas the illness is just going to take its natural course. But there's a lot of emphasis, therefore, that's placed upon the ability to spend time with people and doing things that are relevant and important to you. And then thirdly, there is hospice care, which focuses on the care, the comfort, and quality of life of a person with a serious illness who is approaching the end of their life. Typically, patients in hospice care do not receive medical treatment while in the hospice. And so hospice becomes, again, kind of a way where a person is at the end. They don't want to fight against it. They're going to let death come naturally. They're not worrying about the medical treatments and procedures and things of that nature. Again, they are able to perhaps worry about the quality of their life, who the people are that they're going to be spending their time with, trying to find a sense of solace and a sense of comfort for what is happening. Many people within hospice care, for example, find comfort in religious traditions. I know there was a trend several years ago where individuals would go into hospice facilities, and if the patients were interested, they would share with them, for example, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, where individuals could learn about that transition from this world into the next. And many people found that to be quite comforting, because the idea of leaving this life and everything behind it can be rather scary. People don't really know exactly what it is they can expect. And so this gives them a little insight into perhaps what is coming next, that the transition is peaceful, that people have been doing it for many, many, many years. You're not the first. So those are, three of the major issues or areas when it comes to end-of-life care. But as I said, the focus of our discussion here is going to be on euthanasia, because that's the more controversial. There are a lot of forms of euthanasia. Basic terminology, as I said, euthanasia means help with a good death. It's legally very vague, but useful as a broad descriptive term for all acts of assisted suicide. We have what's called active euthanasia, which is deliberate action to end the life of a dying patient to avoid further suffering. It is an unrequested death, but considered justified on the grounds of compassion. Active euthanasia is something that is essentially always going to be illegal, or at least it always traditionally has been illegal. But people have done it over the years. When the doctor, or perhaps even a family member, feels that that patient's life, there's too much suffering, there's too much misery, even though the patient may not have requested it themselves, that individual takes it upon themselves to end the life of that person based upon the grounds of compassion. And so there is this sense of active euthanasia that can be involuntary or it can be voluntary. Active involuntary euthanasia, there is a lethal injection by a doctor into a dying patient without that patient's express request, which the doctor considers necessary as the only way to relieve the suffering. And so the doctor may choose to take it upon themselves to end the life of that patient because there's so much pain and misery on their part. Of course, a doctor caught doing this would certainly face charges. There is also active voluntary euthanasia, a legal injection by a doctor into a dying patient to end the life at the specific request of the sufferer. And so perhaps the patient themselves are the ones who says, I can't handle the suffering, I can't handle the pain any longer, let's put an end to this. And so the doctor is invited by the patient to give that lethal injection to end that patient's life and their suffering. Again, this would also bring charges. This is illegal. Assisted suicide is providing the means by which a person can take his or her own life. And so perhaps the doctor or other party would not necessarily be responsible for actually killing the patient. The patient would be doing it themselves, but they rely upon that other party to get them the means that they're going to use, whatever the drug is or, whatever. Mercy killing is a term loosely used to describe all acts of euthanasia, but it's best defined as ending another person's life without explicit request, in the belief that it's the only compassionate thing to do. There is what's called passive euthanasia, the deliberate disconnection of life support equipment or the cessation of any life-sustaining medical procedure, permitting the natural death of the patient. This is essentially an option that many people will choose to take. When individuals, for example, have DNR orders, do not resuscitate, the individual gets to that point where they're not able to function on their own. They're being kept alive by machinery. Well, many people would argue that by the course of nature, the will of God, or whatever phrasing you want to use, that person has already met the end of their life, that death is there, and that death should be allowed to end that person's suffering. And so perhaps at that point, you would remove that person from the ventilators, remove that person from the machinery that's pumping their lungs or whatever and making them alive, keeping them alive. And so in that sense, you're not actually deliberately or directly killing that person, but you are removing the tools that are keeping them artificially alive. And again, this is something that can legally be done depending upon the circumstances. Physician aid in dying is a euphemistic term for medical doctors assisting the suicide of a dying patient. One of the key concepts that we hear about in this study of euthanasia today is physician-assisted suicide. Physician-assisted suicide is where the doctor provides the lethal drugs with which the dying person may end their life. Physician-assisted suicide is going to be legalized in several states, in several countries around the world, remains illegal in many others. But essentially what happens is that there would be a morphine drip that is set up, and the patient would have that IV stuck into them. And so the doctor has effectively provided the tools that are necessary. Here is the IV drip. Here is the trigger to release a lethal dose. But that trigger is placed into the hand of the patient. When the patient is ready, when they're prepared, they can press that button themselves. They can end their own life. So the physician is assisting the suicide by providing the drugs that's necessary, by providing the machine that's necessary in order to make it happen, but it is the patient who is ultimately responsible for taking their own life. And finally, there is what's called silent suicide, which is starving oneself to death. This is something that happens in extreme old age. There is no medical intervention or anything of that nature, but with silent suicide, the person simply stops eating, they stop drinking, they stop taking in anything that's going to sustain them and keep them alive. And so again, nature will take its course and that person will cease to exist. Queen Elizabeth I actually ended her life through silent suicide. As I mentioned, physician-assisted suicide is something that has come to be legalized, and quite recently, actually, the first state to legalize it was Oregon in 1997. In that year, Oregon passed a law called the Death with Dignity Act, and through that act, it became the first U.S. state to legalize physician-assisted suicide. There were a lot of provisions that are put into it, a lot of safeguards. First, you can't just say, oh, I want to die, so I'm going to move to Oregon and do so. You must be a resident of that state for at least 5 years prior to the request being made. So, that this is not something where people should be able to just flock in and do it. It's something where the citizens of Oregon have that right. An individual has to be declared terminally ill with no hope whatsoever of recovery. No treatments, no drugs are going to work. This person will eventually die of this ailment. And that must be declared unanimously by 3 doctors. The patient has to undergo a mental evaluation to make sure that their senses and faculty are sound, to make sure that they can make a rational judgment of this magnitude. The request to end their life has to be made in front of witnesses. It can't just be said quietly to a doctor. It has to be said in front of witnesses so that there is clear evidence, clear proof, legally speaking, that this request was made. There's a waiting period as well of several weeks from where the time that the request is made until the actual act is carried out. And that is put in there so that the patient has the time, has the opportunity to think about what it is that they are doing, whether it's something they really truly want, and it gives them that opportunity to pull out. And the patient can pull out at any moment, even after the IV has been stuck into the arm and they've been handed the trigger. They are in control of that trigger mechanism to release the lethal dose of morphine. And so if they choose not to do that, if they change their mind right up to that second, they are able to do so. So there's a lot of protections, there's a lot of provisions that have been put into this, but this becomes the first state and the first law that allows for physician-assisted suicide. Since then, there have been others that have come into play. We currently have 10 states and territories that have legalized physician-assisted suicide, and if you look on the map, they are the ones in the dark blue. So Oregon, Washington State, Colorado, Vermont, California, New Mexico, Maine, New Jersey, Hawaii, Washington, D.C., all of them have legalized physician-assisted suicide and have written their laws largely based upon the Oregon model. In light blue, you'll see Montana. Montana passed a Death with Dignity Act, but it has been challenged within the courts, and so there's that question about it. The states in red, including Ohio, all of these are currently illegal to engage in physician-assisted suicide. So 10 states at this point have, in fact, legalized it. So there are many people that argue that euthanasia is, in and of itself, a good thing, that a person should not be forced to suffer, a person should not have to endure their rehabilitation, they shouldn't have to be a burden upon their families. Because we are autonomous agents, we should have the right to take our own lives, we should have the right to die if we choose in those cases of terminal illness. But of course, there are some problems associated with this. One question, will people be pressured into it, particularly the poor and the elderly, as the cheaper solution? Medicine, as we know, is very expensive. Long hospital stays are very expensive. All of the drugs and the treatment is very expensive. And so when we have individuals who are in a terminal situation and they're simply taking up beds, making use of these equipments, the drugs that are being used for them and so on, the various treatments that are being done, all of that is filling up, more and more and more cost, which has to be paid by somebody, whether it be the patient themselves, whether it be insurance companies, whether it be the American public in general, but somebody's paying for all of this. And so if that person terminated their life, it would certainly be a lot cheaper. It would free up the resources that are being used by that individual. And so the fear is that based upon those circumstances, some people who may not be all that sure about whether they want to end their life or not under these terms might be pressured into it. It might be that, you start thinking about, here's the burden. I mean, how much money am I using that I'm not going to be able to pass on to my family, to my next generation? And I'm concerned with being able to take care of them. And so we could be pressured into it. And of course, something as monumental as this really has to be a matter of free choice, of free decision. The second question is, will we end up with some kind of a slippery slope type of argument where the right to die, which is what we're talking about now, an individual having the right to choose for themselves whether or not they wish to end their life, will we get to the point where that becomes not a right to die, but a duty to die? The Stoic philosopher Seneca. Stoicism was an ancient Roman philosophical tradition which places the value of the state above everything else. And Seneca, towards the end of his life, came to realize that he was a burden to the state, that he was using up resources and not really able to provide anything anymore. And so he was essentially serving no purpose, but yet using up the food, using up the resources, the housing and everything that other people who were more productive to society could do something with. They would be of greater value to the state than he is. And so he felt that it was his civic duty to commit suicide, to take his own life. And so through that Stoic philosophy, we have that idea that the right to die is essentially a duty or an obligation to free up the resources for the next generation. The American novelist Kurt Vonnegut dealt with this issue to some degree in a story called Welcome to the Monkey House. And in his particular case, The issue was not really so much about the end of life issues that we're talking about here. It had more to do with the question of overpopulation. But within the story, they had set up what they call ethical suicide parlors, where an individual who wanted to end their life would be able to come in and, they would have that opportunity to have a quick, clean, easy, efficient death, which got them out of the way, freeing up again the resources for those who remained. And while it wasn't directly forced, the arguments that were made, the advertisements that were made for it, sort of propelled people towards that idea that, am I able to give anything to society? Do I have any real value or purpose here? If not, maybe I should free up this space and these resources for other people. And so I'll go into this ethical suicide parlor and end my life and reduce the population of the earth, and maybe things will be a little bit better then. In either of these cases, the problem, morally speaking, is kind of going back to the first question. Are we being forced? Are we being pressured? Are we being coerced in any way? Because if we are, it should not be allowed. Something as monumental as ending your life should be something that you are fully cognizant of in terms of your sensibilities, and something where your complete autonomy has control. It has to be your choice and not anyone else's.